Hi everyone, this is our last lecture for Key Period 5. This is 5.3 on Reconstruction. And for those of you guys who need a little refresher, Reconstruction it means the reunification of the nation as well as the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Now, we essentially have three different periods of Reconstruction. We have presidential Reconstruction, we're going to have Congressional Reconstruction, and we're going to have a period of military Reconstruction. Now, with the president, Lincoln has kind of a hard position because there is no instructions in the Constitution as to what the president's supposed to do when half the country leaves and goes to war. There's no instruction for that, and so he really kind of has to make it up as he goes along. Now, one of the things before the war even ends that he makes a very strong point to achieve is the passage of the 13th Amendment that outlaws slavery. He knows that the North is going to win the war, and he wants to ensure that when the war is over, it is also that immediate emancipation of those slaves in the South. However, when it comes to the idea of Reconstruction and how we're going to bring the South back into the Union, he wants to ensure that this is going to be as simple as possible. And so we get the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. Amnesty means that you are being given kind of like getting a pardon. And this is sometimes called Lincoln's 10% plan because he was going to require 10% of Southern voters, which are white men, to take an oath of loyalty to the United States, saying that they would be loyal to the United States and its Constitution. And once that happened, that state would then be readmitted into the Union. This was designed to be very quick, to reunite the country and bring the South back. However, as you might guess, this was not very popular among a lot of other people in the North because they felt that it was too lenient on the South, who they felt were responsible for the war because they seceded first. And so this is going to lead to a lot of contention between the legislative and the executive branch. So this brings us to the period of Congressional Reconstruction, and the best way to see this is with the Wade-Davis bill. Congress put together this bill, and it was actually drafted by the Radical Republicans, which is that group of Republicans that blamed the South for the Civil War and wanted, in many ways, revenge for it and wanted to punish them for making the war happen. And their plan was to require 50% of white males to take an ironclad oath of allegiance before the state could call a constitutional convention. Now, what does that mean, an ironclad oath? Well, that means that you have to promise to have never taken up arms against the United States. I want to take a moment and think about that. Do you think at this time in the South, 50% of white males could actually honestly say that? Not even close. And so because of this, they knew that they would have control over those southern states for potentially an entirely new generation, which would allow them the time to put in those changes that they felt necessary to protect the rights of freedmen. Now, going along with that idea, they also would require the states to accept and ratify the 13th Amendment. So not just, hey, we're forcing you to have to free your slaves, but rather you have to vote on it yourselves and to accept it and accept that slavery is over before you could re-enter the Union. As you might guess, this is unlikely to happen, and that is part of the reason why Lincoln pocket vetoes this. Now, this is a different kind of veto than your typical, like, nope, not going to do it kind of veto. A pocket veto is where a president will allow a bill to essentially just die on its own. Each bill has an expiration date on it, and if they allow that expiration date to pass, then the bill is dead and the president doesn't have to vote on it. He doesn't have to decide whether he supports it or not. Here's the reason why Lincoln decides to pocket veto it. If he had just said, nope, not going to do it, we're not going to allow it, he would have really upset the radical Republicans, who were the majority in Congress at that time. And he needed their support in order to get Reconstruction on its feet and to get those protections for newly freedmen that he wanted to ensure. And so he allows this to kind of just disappear on its own, hoping that that'll solve the problem. But all it does is just create greater animosity between the executive branch and the legislative branch. However, that would not last long. And that's because on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth would shoot and kill Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer and a relatively well-known actor of the time. He snuck into Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln and his wife were attending a play in celebration of Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. This is just a couple of days after Lee's surrender. And the country was jubilant that the war was now over. John Wilkes Booth was hoping to send the country into turmoil and hopefully allow the South to rise up again. He snuck into the back of the booth and he shot and killed Abraham Lincoln by shooting him in the back of the head. The picture that you see on the far right is a picture of Abraham Lincoln's death mask. After famous people have died, many times we would do a casting of their face as a way to remember what they looked like. This was really popular in the time before photography, and we have death masks of all kinds of famous people. Obviously Abraham Lincoln, but we have them of Napoleon, we have them of Julius Caesar, and even supposedly of Socrates. So really famous people that we wanted to remember, we did these death masks. And so this is one of our ways to try and remember the man who had brought us through America's worst period, the Civil War. And because of this, America needed the opportunity to mourn their president. So Abraham Lincoln, his body was taken through the major cities, Philadelphia and what you see here in New York, on his way to his final resting place in his home state of Illinois. And it allowed the people of those northern towns to pay their final respects to their dear president. What's interesting is that there is a future president watching Lincoln's funeral in this picture here. If you look on the left-hand side, there is a second-story window, and there are two small bodies in that window. The one on the right-hand side is a 6-year-old Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt and his family were huge supporters of Lincoln and had donated tons of money to Lincoln's campaign. And he did recollect later on in his life that it was, not only did he remember this moment very clearly, but that it had a vast impact on him, that he knew from this moment that he wanted to do as much for America as Abraham Lincoln had done, and that it was a key moment in his life when he felt the need to have a life of public service. And this would be a defining moment for Theodore Roosevelt and much of the rest of the nation. And so now when the president dies, the vice president takes over, and that's going to be Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson kind of gets thrown into the Reconstruction thing and has to come up with a plan. His plan is kind of a combination of what the radical Republicans wanted as well as Lincoln. He takes the 10% plan as well as adds in that leading Confederates would be disenfranchised. They would lose their power and lose the opportunity to vote. Plus, he said that the states must protect the rights of newly freedmen. And this was, in his eyes, going to be a good compromise. However, it doesn't go over well and Congress doesn't approve it. And that's partially just because of who Johnson was. Please remember, the guy is a Southerner. He's from the state of Tennessee. He's the only Southern congressman that didn't walk out when the South seceded. But he's still a Southerner. And so Northern Republicans didn't trust him. Plus, he is a Democrat. It's from the wrong party. It was the party that supported slavery. And so again, they just don't trust the guy. And so because of this, there is increased tension between the two groups. And it gets worse when in 1866, he goes ahead and he vetoed the Civil Rights Bill that would have defined citizenship for freedmen. Now, Congress was able to override the veto with a 2/3 of a vote, but this still shows Congress that there is no cooperation between the executive and the legislative. And so they decide that the best way for them to deal with this is to get rid of the president. And so Congress designed for Johnson to be impeached. They created a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And essentially it said that whoever the Senate hired, only the Senate could fire. And this was directly in regards to the Secretary of War, Edward M. Stanton, who Johnson could not stand. And they knew that Johnson wanted to fire the guy. But every cabinet member is essentially hired by the Senate. They're nominated by the president, and then the Senate says, yeah, that guy's cool. Well, he goes ahead and he fires Stanton anyway, and they decide to impeach him. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of unfamiliar with that term, to be impeached doesn't mean that you're kicked out of office. It means that you're brought to trial. And so he was brought to trial, and it was close. They needed 2/3 of Congress to support it, or rather 2/3 of the Senate to vote in favor of impeachment, to vote to say that he was guilty of this. And it came within one vote. That he actually not only was found not guilty, but was able to keep his job, because there was a fear that it would create instability, which could potentially lead to the South rising up again. But also it would set a really dangerous example that, you know, if we just don't like a president, we'll just kick him out. And so while he wasn't impeached, he also didn't really get anything else done. And so this led to even greater fears for newly freed slaves, as well as the future of Reconstruction itself. And so because they knew they couldn't trust Johnson to protect African Americans, they decided that they would do something that would force him to protect their rights, and that would be a constitutional amendment. And that brings us to the 14th Amendment. And it's the next logical step. We freed these slaves, but we didn't really have any legal standing for them. We didn't really have any definition of like who they were to us politically. And so we had this very broad definition of citizenship. Anyone that was born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen. And being a citizen, you were not to be denied your natural rights by the state or local government without due process, basically without being proven guilty of some kind of crime. You also had to be given equal treatment under the law. And this is going to be a really important thing later on when we get to the civil rights movement, where we see that this is going to be the big argument as to why having black schools and white schools is not fair. But there's a secondary part to this. And they said, look, if you don't follow these rules, we'll cut your congressional representation, and then you don't get a voice in your government. As well as we're going to make sure that those that fought against us do not get a voice in the government as well. And so Confederate leaders would also be disqualified from federal offices. But what this does is that this takes the traditional leadership of the South and throws it out the window. And so there's a big scramble to figure out who's going to be in charge, which we'll discuss in just a couple of minutes. Now, one final thing I want to look at is this political cartoon looking at the 14th Amendment. Here we have Congress, a big fat man laying in a hammock of law enforcement, and he's snoozing away. And underneath him, we see a gun that's marked 14th Amendment, second section, which is that part that says if you don't protect the rights of freedmen that and treat them equally under the law, that you will lose your congressional representation. Next to that, you have a little black boy who has a drum ready to beat on it and wake Congress up. But the elephant, the Republican Party, is telling the donkey, the Democrats, as well as the little boy, don't wake him up. Don't wake Congress up. Don't try and bring attention to this problem. Now, that was really in regards to African American organizations in the South that were trying to enforce this. But Congress didn't really want to do it because they were trying to bring both sides back together again. And by reducing the Southern representation, A, they knew that it would be harder for blacks in the South to get an equal voice, but B, they knew it was just going to be harder to kind of metaphorically bring the South back into the Union. So the final period of Reconstruction is going to be military Reconstruction. And this was put together in the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into 5 different military districts. And again, this kind of makes sense. We've decided that we need to, enforce the freeing of the slaves. We need to enforce the protection of their property rights and their rights of citizenship. But do you really think that the Southern governments are going to do that? No, obviously not. So we were going to send Union troops down into the South, separated into these 5 military districts, and essentially the military would control the South until they could prove that they were going to follow the rules, that they had ratified the 13th and 14th Amendments, that they had guaranteed black suffrage. And only at that point, not only would the states be readmitted, but also it would only be after that point that the military would then leave. But the thing was that even after the states had done that, the military didn't leave those districts. And it was because they just couldn't trust the South to not overstep the boundaries of those laws and to infringe the rights of African Americans. Also going along with Reconstruction, though, we have 2 groups that are going to cause a lot of turmoil in kind of the local level of Reconstruction, and that is going to be carpetbaggers and scalawags. A scalawag is a Southerner who either joined the Republican Party, which was a Northern political party essentially, or somebody who supported Reconstruction. Those were seen to be Northern ideas and Northern beliefs, and so those people were seen as traitors to their cause, traitors to the South, and so they were very much derided, and the scalawag name was a derogatory name for these people. Another group are carpetbaggers, which are Northerners that moved to the South during Reconstruction. And they had moved there in order to open up businesses or to buy farms. And in many ways, they did help in the rebuilding of the South. But you have to look at it from a Southerner's perspective. They've been invaded and defeated by a Northern army, and now they're having these Northerners moving into their territory after they've been defeated and opening up businesses and profiting from the defeated South. You can understand why there was so much hatred for these people. And these groups were targeted by Southerners and were driven out of town a lot of times, or even lynched. And so there was a lot of hatred for these folks that were supporting Reconstruction efforts. The next topic we're going to look at is trying to figure out what happens to these newly freed slaves and kind of what that meant for them. And in reality, it was difficult because they had to define their own sense of freedom. Imagine what it was like that you've been a slave your entire life. Your parents were slaves, your grandparents, your great-grandparents were all slaves. You have had no rights, you have no freedoms, you have no property, you have nothing. And then suddenly one day somebody says, hey, by the way, you're no longer a slave. Part of you would be thrilled, but there would be a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty that came along with that. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I get revenge? Now, on smaller farms, when there were only a few slaves that worked side by side with their masters, many times they actually did stay behind. Many times they didn't get paid. They would only ask for continued room and board from their former masters, that they were free in name, they were free politically, but they remained with their former masters because of loyalty, also because many of them didn't even ask for payment because they knew that their masters couldn't afford it. And so in some cases, they did choose to stay in a essentially slave system. Others, as soon as they found out that they were free, especially on larger farms where there were large numbers of slaves that were vastly mistreated, they got up and went. I mean, they got out of the South as quickly as their legs could take them, and they went to the North or they went to the West where they had greater opportunities. There was also a small group that did use the opportunity to get revenge on their former masters. That when word of emancipation got out, that they began to attack their former masters and overseers, and they would beat them, they would whip them, and in some cases even killed them out of hatred for the treatment that they had received. And in some ways tried to kind of give these white men a taste of their own medicine. Now, this group was relatively small. There weren't a lot of people that did this, but you can imagine, just from a Southerner's perspective, seeing these black men and women rising up and attacking their white masters. That would have been terrifying to their way of life and their sense of the way the world should work. And so these stories became really the focus of what it was like happening in the South when you freed these slaves. Oh, see, this is what we told you. This is exactly what we said would happen. You give them freedom and they go crazy and they start killing white people. And like I said, that was actually really pretty rare, but just the fact that it happened, just like it confirmed the fears of whites in the South, and thus became the narrative of the South of this is what happens when you give black people freedom. Another problem for these newly freedmen was trying to figure out how to survive after freedom. They had grown up and they had been on plantations and they had had food and medical care and housing taken care of for them. Granted, they were in a horrible, oppressive system, but they had never really had to figure that out on their own. And so when emancipation suddenly happened, they really relied on each other for support and in order to encourage their survival. And one of the big things that allowed for this to happen was churches. Church had always been a sense of community for African Americans, but never more so than after the Civil War was over, after the 13th Amendment, because that was a place that was safe for them. It was a place that they already knew to congregate, and it would become a sense of identity for them as a community. This is a place where they would organize everything from political groupings and trying to encourage people to vote, to finding ways to deal with a lack of economic resources, to push for community solving problems and things like this, as well as defending themselves from a very angry white society. And so churches were a really, really important place and would continue to be so for African Americans, and would be a core place for the formation of the civil rights movement that would occur in the 1950s and 60s. One of the other big things that happened in these churches was the establishment of schools. They had a church, they may not have a school building, so you might have the school in the church as well. But the black community knew one thing. If they wanted their kids to not have to be a farmer, if they wanted their kids to have the opportunity for a better life, the only way to do it was through education. And to be able to read and write and do math, that was going to give them opportunities that was far beyond farming that most of their parents would have only been have available. Now, these schools were not well funded, and in many cases, the African American community went without a lot of things in order to just scrape by enough money to put these schools together and to hire a teacher. But on the positive side, this was very equalizing in a lot of ways, because it did allow them opportunities for advancement that they wouldn't have had otherwise. Another really important group is going to be social clubs. They started to develop their own social clubs as kind of a place to congregate outside of church. And a really important one of these is the Union League. This was actually like a club of clubs. So there's a bunch of different clubs within the Union League. And these groups would all congregate together and try and share resources and support each other, and really became kind of a center of Black support during this period of time. They also would push for Republican candidates in all of these different places because the Republican Party had been the party that freed the slaves, and so that became the party that former slaves all joined, and would remain that way until the Great Depression, when they would shift over to the Democratic Party in vast numbers and remain today as one of the biggest voter bases for the Democratic Party. Another group designed to help these former slaves was the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was actually created well before the Civil War was over as a way to deal with many of the problems that freedmen were going to face. If you think about it, these people are really we're kind of throwing them into a horrible situation. Yes, we are giving them freedom and we're giving them political opportunity, but they don't have skills, they don't have education, they don't have money, they don't have training. And so because of that, we're essentially dooming them to be poor and dooming them to be taken advantage of by the white majority. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was designed in order to deal with that. They provided food, clothing, healthcare, education to these newly freed slaves. This was led by the man you see in the picture here, General O.O. Howard. And the organization initially had a lot of support in Congress and a lot of support by President Lincoln. But after Lincoln's death and under Johnson, as well as the growing number of southern states that are re-entering the Union, the popularity begins to wane, and they do have very minimal success. Southerners don't want to dedicate any money or funds to this. They don't approve of it. They don't like the idea of helping former slaves, as well as Northerners just kind of got tired of spending the money on it as well. And so there is very little success with it in the long term. There wasn't enough money to feed all the people that it needed to feed. There wasn't enough money to provide the health care or the clothing or the education. However, education would be the one place where they would have some success because they did scrape together enough money to hire the initial teachers for many of those Black schools, and that would allow for enough Blacks to then get the education necessary to then teach the next generation. Also, now that that Reconstruction is underway and white Southerners are unable to vote, we want to also take the next step, the next logical step when it comes to the rights of freedmen. We have freed the slaves. We have then defined kind of who they are to us politically by making them citizens and making sure that they have the protection of their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Well, what's the next logical thing to do to protect the rights of a citizen? Make sure that they have the right to vote. And so the 15th Amendment is going to be passed. It gives all men the right to vote, regardless of their race, color, creed, or previous servitude. And so this is going to be a great equalizer in America at this time. It's going to be further supported by the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which would require full and equal access to things like jury service, transportation, and public accommodations. Now, this right here would be very much overlooked by Southerners, and Southerners would find as many ways as possible to deny Blacks the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. However, it was really hard for them to do that initially because so many of them had been denied their vote because they had either not taken the oath of allegiance to the U.S. or because they had been high-ranking Confederates and no longer had the opportunity to vote again. And so because of this, we have our very first Black congressman. On the left, we have Hiram Revels, who was a Republican from Mississippi, who was the first Black senator. And shortly after he would be elected, Joseph Rainey, a Republican from South Carolina, would be elected as the first Black congressman in the House of Representatives. And so we are going to see a larger number of African Americans who are leading in both state and national levels. And they do bring up a lot of issues that are particularly facing the African American community. And because of this, there is going to be money donated towards that community. However, once whites are able to come back to power in the South, African Americans are no longer going to be able to get those offices. It will be designed so that they can't get those offices, and thus those monies are then going to be taken away from the community as well. A final issue for newly freedmen was to figure out exactly what were they going to do. Like do as in like a job. Like they had always been farmers, and the South didn't really have a lot of industry, and so you might as well do what you know. But many of them didn't necessarily want to remain in the South because of just the discrimination that occurred there. And this was something that was understood by Lincoln even during the Civil War. And the Homestead Act of 1862 was passed, and it provided for any citizen who had never taken up arms against the United States could claim 160 acres of federal land virtually for free. All this land that was out in the West, in the plains, as well as kind of towards the West Coast, they could claim that land virtually for free. Now, this was trying to encourage freemen in the South, as well as slaves, to defect from the South and to escape northward and take on those land, as well as poor whites who had been disenfranchised in many ways by the powerful Southern elite, and convince poor whites from the South to defect to the North to take advantage of this. And so this was a really popular thing among African Americans after the Civil War was over, for a place for them to get control of land for themselves. We also are going to see a little bit of this happen during the Civil War with Special Field Order number 15. What this would do is the federal government would confiscate land from prominent Confederates. People like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis would lose their land, and that would be given over to these former slaves and kind of divvied out to them. And it was, it promoted, or it is the birth of a very common phrase at the time, which was you would get 40 acres and a mule. That you could get 40 acres of this former Confederate land and a mule to help you tend the land. And this was a really exciting prospect for African Americans, that they were going to be able to stay near their family, stay in a place that was familiar to them, but be able to have access to this land. And while some of this land was confiscated and then was redistributed to former slaves, once whites got back into power in the South, they found ways to take that land back away from those freedmen. Finally, we have the exodusters. These were African Americans that just hightailed it out of the South completely and moved to Kansas in the period after the Civil War, roughly in the late 1870s. And they were moving there because there was so much open federal land that was virtually free, that was very cheap. And so it was a way for them to escape the discrimination of the South, while still maintaining an agricultural lifestyle that they were used to. So this brings us to our next topic, which is how Southerners were able to maintain their traditional system within the South and kind of the society and the politics that they were used to. And I want to look at this political cartoon because it's a really prominent one from the time. It was illustrated by Thomas Nast, the same man who did the political cartoons of Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall Ring. And he was the prominent political cartoonist of his time. Now in this, he is showing the results of Reconstruction in the South, and that in their eyes that this was a white man's government, and that it was a union as it was between whites to keep blacks below them, to keep them subservient. And it was seen as a lost cause, and even worse than slavery, that at least as a slave, you had value. As a slave, you were worth something. As a free black, you have no worth. And if we kill you, it doesn't matter. And so you see in the picture here them being lynched, their schools being burned to the ground, families cowering in fear from these groups like the KKK, as well as a group called the White League. The White League was kind of like the KKK, except for instead of being one that was known for its overt violence, as you can see with the knives and the guns, the White League was more economic and political. These would be business leaders, these would be politicians, these would be your mayor, or even the head of the local police force that were promoting white causes at this time. And so essentially what Thomas Nast is trying to show is that Reconstruction has actually made the lives of African Americans worse than even under slavery. So in the South, there are two different views on how Reconstruction should go. The first of these was something called the New South. A lot of Southerners realized that the reason that they lost the war was because they weren't diversified. They were only an agricultural society, and because of that, they didn't have the railroads, the telegraphs, or the industry in order to go up against the North. And so they knew that to be able to compete against the North, even now after the war, they needed to be more diverse. They needed to have greater crop variety, and they needed to industrialize in order to compete. And there was a lot of industry being brought to the South at that time. And today it is considered to be still a very industrial area. There's a lot of factories and industry in the South today as a result of that New South movement. However, not everybody's in favor of that because they see that as bringing the North to the South. That's kind of like trying to invade the South yet again in an economic way. And many of these people are what we call redeemers. These were white Southern Democrats who wanted to bring back the old political system and the old way of life. And so they were looking to get rid of the Republican governments, and specifically the governments in the South that were being run by freedmen, ones that were being run by scalawags, those Southern supporters of Reconstruction. And they felt that these people were destroying the South. And you can see that in this political cartoon. In this right here up at the very top, that's Ulysses S. Grant, who is now President of the United States after Andrew Johnson. And you see him as a carpetbagger that is riding the back of the solid South. And you can see the burden that the South is having to bear, the chains to the military that are here. It's extremely symbolic, showing that the South feels like they are being not only insulted, but also being damaged by this Northern position. And so the Redeemer governments are going to pretty much reverse pretty much everything from Reconstruction. Also, we're going to see whites try and maintain politically, economically, and socially the subservience of blacks to whites, create and ensure white superiority and white supremacy. And one of the ways we see this is economically. Southern plantation owners, as soon as the states were brought back into the Union, found ways to retain or regain their power and their land. And so they are going to continue to have the majority of power. Now, one of the things that is a problem for these plantation owners, though, is the nature of slavery being gone. You had a plantation, you have this vast amount of land that you have to farm, and you used to have slaves to do the job for you, but now you don't. You still have the same amount of land, but you don't have any workers, and to hire all of them would be incredibly expensive. But these former slaves, they don't have anywhere to live. So you tell them, hey, you can live in your old slave cabins, and I will let you rent that land from me. And that way my land gets farmed, you have a place to live, and you have a source of income. This is a system called sharecropping. And the landowners would allow the tenants to use their land to farm on the land, and your rent would be a share of your crop. Sometimes as high as 50% of your crop, which means you only have half of your crop to sell for profit. And because of that, blacks were not going to be able to, these sharecroppers were not going to be able to make a lot of money. And also, even just to begin the process, they, they would have to buy tools, they would have to buy seeds, and they didn't have any money to start off with. So they borrow money from their former masters. And so they start off in debt and are continuously in debt to their former masters, never really being able to climb out of it, and essentially thus are working the land for free, which is another word for slavery. Just, not in the legal sense. Now, politically, we're going to have the issue of subservience being tied to a cultural item, and that is Jim Crow. So back in this period of time, a popular entertainment venue was the minstrel show. It was like a variety show. You'd have a little bit of music, have a little bit of dance, have a juggler, a comedy scene or two, things like this. And one of the most popular characters in that was a character called Jim Crow. And this was the happy-go-lucky Southern black man. Wasn't very smart, but was just happy to be there. And it was always played by a white man that was in blackface. And this was just a really popular, very common character that you saw in these minstrel shows. And because of this, it was kind of the phrase that was used to refer to a lot of things that were kind of whites, kind of keeping blacks in a subservient place, that kind of make fun of them or make sure that they are lower than whites. And we'll see that politically through things like black codes. These were local laws that were passed to keep freedmen in a subservient position by denying their right to serve on a jury, or from holding local office, or arresting them for idleness. They could literally be arrested for not being able to get a job. But really, who's going to hire a black man in the South? No one. So they're going to be punished for the fact that no one will hire them. We also see the rise of Jim Crow laws. These are local laws and state laws that created segregation of the races of black and white in public places. Schools and restaurants and doctor's offices and things like this were going to be segregated between black and white. And this leads us to probably the biggest, most important Supreme Court case of its time, and one of the most important in our class. In fact, in the AP course outline, there are only 3 Supreme Court cases that are mentioned by name, and this is one of them. So hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, this is going to be on the test. And this is the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The man you see in the picture there is Homer Plessy, and Homer Plessy was 1/8 black. That means that one of his great-grandparents was African American. Now, if you look at him, he doesn't look black. And that was the whole point. See, Southerners, Southern blacks wanted to test out whether the 14th Amendment really was going to be upheld in the South, whether blacks were going to be treated equally to whites. And one of the biggest places that this was evident as not being true was on the railroads. There was a huge difference between the white car and the colored car on the railroads. White cars were nice, padded seats, food offered. You had even sleeper cars where you could essentially have like a hotel room on the train itself, versus the colored car, which oftentimes was a hard wooden bench, maybe sometimes not even without a back on it. And sometimes these railroad cars didn't even have a roof on them. And yet, black patrons paid the exact same fare as a white patron. Obviously, that's not fair. And so Southern black organizations were trying to test out whether they would support this unequal treatment. And that's where Homer Plessy comes in. He basically answered a newspaper ad saying, hey, I'll be willing to test this out, and went onto a white car of a railroad. And nobody said anything because he didn't look black, he looked white. And he actually had to announce to the conductor, hey, by the way, I'm black. And it was only after that that they tried to kick him off of the train. And that's when he then starts this, this court case. It goes to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney upholds the constitutionality of these Jim Crow laws, saying that segregation in public facilities was okay as long as the facilities were equal. And so this doctrine of separate but equal is now established in America as being okay under federal law, and thus essentially means that Jim Crow laws are okay under federal law. And the thing is that they would all be separate, but they definitely would not be equal. But this would remain the tradition in the South and really across America for the next 100 years. Southern whites were also extremely concerned about keeping blacks socially subservient to whites, to keep the Southern way of life and to remind blacks, quote unquote, of their proper place. And that is where we see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is a secret society that was designed to intimidate and terrorize blacks in the South. It was also known as the Invisible Empire of the South because it was a secret society. It was organized by the man you see in the picture here, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and former Confederate soldiers. And they would hide their faces and disguise their horses as they went about trying to maintain the traditional social status of whites being superior to blacks. And they did this through terror and violence. They would attack or burn down black churches, black schools, black businesses, that they would attack African Americans. They would even lynch them in many cases. And they also targeted scalawags, they targeted carpetbaggers, and targeted Republicans in the state as well. They were very much tied to the Democratic Party, and they had this campaign of murder and terror throughout the South that would remain for well over a century afterward. And because they were masked men, most people didn't realize that these were also the men who ran your city and your state, that this was your mayor, that this was the head of the police force. And the people that were supposed to uphold the law and supposed to protect the black community were the very same ones that were terrorizing them under these cloaks. And so Southern whites were trying to find other ways to also make sure that blacks stayed politically subservient to whites. And they did this to disenfranchise them. Typically that term means to take away someone's power, to take away their voice. But in this sense, it particularly means to take away their right to vote. And the first way that they did that was through the poll tax. Literally a tax you had to pay in order to vote. And while it may not have been a lot of money to many other people, for a newly freed slave, that was money they didn't have. And so because of that, it kept a lot of them away from their right to vote. Another thing was a literacy test. Literacy tests were designed apparently to determine whether somebody had the ability to read and thus would be an informed voter. But it wasn't really designed to do that. It actually was designed in order to make sure that illiterate blacks were unable to vote. And being, newly freed slaves, they wouldn't have that education. But even if you were an educated black person, it was still virtually impossible to pass these. They were designed to be confusing, and if you missed even one question, you would be denied your right to vote. We also have something called gerrymandering, and gerrymandering comes from a governor back in the 1800s, Governor Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and he redrew the district lines for his area of Massachusetts in order to benefit his political party, the Democratic Republicans, over the Federalists. And the way that he drew the new district line, it kind of looked like a little bit of like a salamander, and kind of looked a little bit like that. And so they called it Jerry, as in Eldridge gerrymandering. And this is designed in order to keep one particular group of people from having power. And so to better explain this idea, I'll actually be bringing you to a video here. Now, when you consider things like poll taxes, literacy tests, as well as gerrymandering, it could definitely prevent blacks from having power in their government. But it also could prevent whites from having power in their government as well. You did have poor whites, you did have dumb whites, and so they needed to find a way in order to allow them the right to vote still. And that was something called the grandfather clause. And the idea of this was that if your grandfather was eligible to vote before these laws were passed, then you would be eligible to vote. So the grandfathers of newly freed slaves did not have the right to vote. Therefore, they would not be eligible for this clause. Whereas stupid, dumb white folk, because of my dear old grandpappy, I gets to vote, despite the fact that I can't read and I don't have any money. So this, again, helps reassure that whites would remain superior to blacks, even if they too were poor and uneducated. So finally, we're going to look at what happens as a result of Reconstruction in America. And the first group we got to look at is women. Before the Civil War, women had all considered themselves to be enslaved, that they were enslaved to their male masters, that regardless of your race, regardless of your economic status, you were lower than men and you did not have a political, a social, or an economic voice. And so they considered themselves all to be enslaved. And these women did put the women's rights movement on hold during the Civil War because they were so heavily involved in the abolitionist movement. And in this abolitionist movement, they learned how to organize, they learned how to prioritize their issues, and how to be effective in getting government change. However, when the Civil War was over and the 15th Amendment was passed, they noticed that they were overlooked, that they were not directly addressed in the 14th or 15th Amendment, that they were not fully recognized as citizens and were not protected the right to vote. The 15th Amendment says that the right of suffrage will not be denied based on your race, color, creed, or previous servitude. It says nothing about your gender. And now that these women were politically active, they would continue to make this an issue on the national stage. And we will see the creation of new organizations that are going to further the women's suffrage cause. Specifically, we are going to see groups like the National Women's Suffrage Association, which will eventually become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. The one big problem that we have, though, is that we see a split in the movement. That although women were looking for suffrage, white women wanted to distance themselves from black women because they felt that they would be more likely to get the right to vote if they did not associate with the lower class, and so or the lower race in that sense. And so they distanced themselves, and that was a problem because they did limit the numbers that were fighting for women's rights, and black women felt that they were being overlooked, were being kind of ignored in the women's rights movement, and were not as vocal as many white women were. And it wasn't because it wasn't important to them, but it was because they felt that they were not welcome into that realm. And it did make the women's rights movement probably slower to be resolved as a result. And so we see the official end of Reconstruction, ladies and gentlemen. Now, unfortunately, in 1873, we have the slaughterhouse cases. These were some cases by the Supreme Court in 1873 that very much diminished the power of the 14th Amendment. It argued that it only offered federal protection, that it had nothing to do with state protection of equal protection under the law or rights of citizens of their, the protection of their natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and that civil rights violations were state issues, not federal issues. And this just shows how much the Northern resolve was beginning to waste away, that they had been fighting against the South for so long, not just physically fighting in the Civil War, but they had been fighting them politically to get things changed for so long that they were just tired of it. They had their own issues, their own concerns, they had things that they wanted to accomplish, and so they were just kind of tired of rehashing this same issue over and over and over again. However, when it came to the election of 1876, they were willing to put up one final fight. In 1876, neither candidate, either Rutherford B. Hayes, who is pictured here, or Governor Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat from New York, ended up getting enough of the electoral vote. Or rather, they both did, because the northern states did not count the votes of the southern states, especially the ones that they felt had not completed the requirements of Reconstruction. And so they didn't count all the votes, so obviously their guy won. On the southern side, they didn't really count all the votes of the northerners and very much counted the votes of the southern states only, and thus their guy won. So nobody won. And because it was so contested, they decided that they were going to put together a special commission where there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and they basically got together in a back room and figured out who should win the election. And the way it came down to was that Hayes would be allowed to become president. The Republican would be allowed to become president, with the promise that as soon as he came into office, he would end military occupation of the South and essentially end Reconstruction. Republicans were so fearful of a Democratic president and what he could potentially turn around and potentially reverse from Reconstruction and potentially inspire the South to rise up again, that they were willing to allow Reconstruction to end in order to make sure that there was a Republican in the White House. And this is what is going to lead to Rutherford B. Hayes earning the nickname of Rutherford B. Hayes. And when the Union troops left the South, it was the final nail in the coffin for African Americans that were still there. That all of the things that had been fought for, all of the rights that had been secured, were no longer going to be watched over by the federal government, that they were on their own and they were surrounded by a state and a region that would do everything possible to limit their rights and restrict their opportunities. And so this would unfortunately remain that way until we get to the civil rights movement 100 years later. So that's the end of Key Period 5, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving break, and I'll see you guys in a week.